Welcome to another episode of Judge for Yourself. South Africa recently celebrated 20 years of democracy. Truth about it is in 1994 we began our constitutional journey. It seems to me 20 years later is a time, elections notwithstanding, it's a time to actually reflect on how far we've actually journeyed in those 20 years. How far have we gone towards constructing the society which is predicated on the three foundational constitutional values of equality, freedom, and dignity. Now, in order to participate, you can do so by twittering us the hashtag JFYDemocracy. To discuss this particular topic, we are joined by Dr. Pallo Jordan, who was in that initial cabinet from 1994 to 2009. Tony Leon, who was also in Parliament at the time and then became the leader of the DA right through until 2006, and Professor Xolela Mangcu, who's an academic and a professor of sociology at UCT. But before we commence the debate, can I just share with you a few words from an interview that Archbishop Emeritus Desmond Tutu gave at a special conference to celebrate 20 years of democracy.
We are a country where everybody can feel they matter. It's a country where nobody should be going to bed hungry. It's a disgrace. This is a country where we shouldn't read stories of a 6-year-old falling into a latrine hole. Shouldn't happen. It's unconscionable.
Dr. Jordan, how do you respond to that? He's become very critical of what's happened. 20 years later, he says these things shouldn't happen. He's right about that.
Of course, he's absolutely right. But these things happen everywhere, regrettably. The richest countries in the world, you have children go to bed hungry. In the United States, it happens in many parts of Europe. It's unconscionable, to be sure, but it's not unique to South Africa. The tragedy of a 6-year-old falling into a pit latrine, obviously the terrible tragedy shouldn't happen, but I wouldn't assess South African democracy on the basis of the tragedies that have occurred.
How would you then, if I could ask you to summarize it, what's your assessment of our 20 years? You were in that first cabinet. You obviously had dreams, expectations. You had a long and very distinguished record of struggle beforehand. When you look back after 20 years, are you satisfied?
No, I'm not satisfied, but I am happy. I am happy because I think we have radically transformed the political culture of this country. South Africa before 1994 was notorious for state arbitrariness, government arbitrariness. That has been put an end to very radically. You have a very active constitutional court which protects our democratic liberties. We have a very committed public protector who protects our liberties. We have a host of Chapter 9 institutions that protect our liberties. So the political culture of South Africa has been completely transformed, and that makes me very, very optimistic.
All right. I'll come back to you if I may. I mean, you're in the same position in a way. You were there in that 1990. You admittedly, I think your party only had 1.2% of the...
1.7 accrued.
I'm awfully sorry about that. 1.7. But you weren't the leader. You weren't the leader. I know that. Dr. De Beer was at that time. But you tell me, 20 years later, what do you feel?
You know, to quote someone else, if South Africa does not leave you feeling full of ambivalence, you've not been paying attention. I think there's a paradox here. I agree with what Pallo said about it's incontestably better than it was during the apartheid years, but what are we comparing? Exactly. I mean, Xolela and I were at a conference where one of the participants said, but that's comparing yourself against a state which was declared to be practicing policies that were crime against humanity. So against a very low bar, we've done much better than that.
Well, I think what Dr. Jordan and I was saying is the fact is that we should at least celebrate that where we've come to is not unimportant.
Look, it could be much worse if you take that viewpoint.
Yes.
And I agree with him that there are these pushback mechanisms in our society. There are a few more. We do have an independent media that is pretty vigorous in its reporting. On the other hand, we have cascading corruption, which now, according to the Auditor General, one of the Chapter 9 bodies that Pallo drew attention to, costs the taxpayer and the state 30 billion rand every year in misspent expenditure. And of course, our political accountability is not perhaps what it was in the first phase of the democratic parliament and the democratic practice.
Professor.
I'm unhappy, unlike Dr. Jordan. I'm very unhappy, and I would be insincere if I said I'm happy.
Do you accept
my public writings, testify to the fact that I've been unhappy for the past 2 decades, and that's because I had certain expectations. My bar was actually quite high, and it was a prospective bar as opposed to a retrospective bar.
So very briefly, what were your expectations, and what hasn't been fulfilled?
My expectations were that black people would be in a position where philosophically, intellectually, culturally, would be laying out the direction for the country in terms of the values, just providing not issues that have to do with just jobs and food and housing. I'm talking here about higher order values, issues. I come from the Black consciousness movement, issues that have to do with pride, with self-reliance, with self-determining freedom, values of that order. And for the past 20 years, no one could say black people have been able to achieve that. Our schools are failing, and that's where actually it all starts, with education. So those are the things that, there was a promise with the African Renaissance. When Thabo Mbeki came up with that, many of us were hopeful, but then that just died.
So you have a much more gloomy assessment.
I have a very,
which I'm going to develop with you, but
assessment.
I just want to take a break, and then we'll carry on with the assessment, gloomy or otherwise.
News that moves. ENCA.com.